A young millionaire came home earlier than expected after an appointment was suddenly cancelled. As he parked in the garage, the cleaner's daughter rushed to him in panic, whispering, "Uncle, stay quiet. Your friend and the lady are in the room speaking badly about you." But when he finds out who it was, his blood froze instantly. The soft whisper of the electric motor was the only thing that broke the afternoon silence on the tree-lined drive of majestic oaks. Richard maneuvered his luxury sedan up the winding entrance to his sprawling estate, feeling a sudden pang of frustration mixed with unexpected relief. The meeting with international investors, the culmination of months of relentless work, had been postponed at the last minute. On one hand, the adrenaline rush of closing the deal had dissipated, leaving a void. On the other, the prospect of an unexpected free afternoon in his own sanctuary was a rare gift. He pictured his wife, Helen, reading in the garden, her blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight, perhaps surprising her with an impromptu lunch. Life, for Richard, was a harmonious balance between the ambition that had propelled him to the top and the tranquility he found in the arms of those he loved. His faith in people was the bedrock of his empire. He believed loyalty was a two-way street, and until now, the world seemed to agree with him. As he stepped out of the car, the quietude of the house enveloped him. There was no sound of the TV in the living room, no hum of the vacuum cleaner that Vera, the housekeeper, usually ran at this hour. Only the distant chirping of a bird and the rustle of leaves. Strange. He walked across the marble entryway, noticing a car that shouldn't have been there, discreetly parked near the service garage. It was Luke's sedan, his best friend and business partner. Richard's mind immediately sought a logical explanation. Luke was supposed to be in Chicago, finalizing preparations for an expansion. Perhaps his flight had been cancelled too, and he'd come to surprise him. He smiled at the thought, already planning to open a bottle of wine to celebrate the coincidence. He trusted Luke like a brother, the man with whom he'd shared dreams and projects since their college days, the other half of his entrepreneurial vision. But Richard's smile died before it even fully formed. A small figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway leading to the kitchen, running toward him, bare feet barely touching the cool floor. It was Sophia, Vera's 7-year-old daughter, a girl with big, expressive eyes, whom he treated with the affection of an uncle. During school breaks, she always accompanied her mother, and the house gained a childish joy that Richard secretly adored. However, the expression on the child's face was not one of joy. There was fear, an urgency that made Richard's heart clench. She put her tiny index finger to her lips, and her voice, choked by a frightened whisper, uttered the words that would shatter the foundation of his world. "Uncle Rich." "Shh," she whispered, tugging on his pant leg. "Aunt your friend and Aunt Helen are upstairs, in the bedroom, talking about you." Richard froze, initial confusion giving way to a chill running down his spine. "Your friend," she'd said, Luke's car outside. "Aunt Helen," she meant Helen. The two of them, together in his bedroom, in the middle of the afternoon, talking about him in secret. The child's innocence left no room for misinterpretation. She wasn't making it up. He knelt down, looking into Sophia's frightened eyes, and felt the first tremor of a reality he had never imagined. Silently, he climbed the stairs, his heart pounding against his ribs. His bedroom door was ajar, and from within came the muffled sound of voices. Luke's voice, unmistakable, and Helen's, soft and complicit. He crept closer, holding his breath, and heard a sentence that hit him like a punch. "We need to resolve his situation once and for all," Luke said. "With the information you have, we can make it look like he's unstable. He won't be a problem for us anymore." The air in Richard's lungs froze, turning into shards of ice that seemed to pierce his chest. Every word he heard from beyond the door was a blow, a hammer strike dismantling the structure of his life, beam by beam. Helen, his partner, the woman with whom he shared his deepest fears and highest dreams. Luke, the friend who was more than a brother. The godfather of his plans, the co-architect of his success, the two people in whom he placed blind, absolute trust, were there, in his private sanctuary, weaving his ruin. The phrase about his instability echoed in his mind, revealing the cruelty of the plan. It wasn't just about money, it was personal annihilation, an attack on his sanity, his very identity. For an instant, the world seemed to tilt, and he had to brace his hand against the cold corridor wall to keep from collapsing. The primitive urge to kick down the door, to confront the betrayal with the fury boiling in his blood, was crushed by a sharper instinct, the same one that guided him in business, strategic patience. To confront them now would be suicide. It would give them exactly what they wanted, proof of a man out of control. With superhuman effort, he retreated. Each step back, an act of simultaneous denial and acceptance. His feet, encased in expensive dress shoes, moved across the Persian rug with the lightness of a thief in his own home. He descended the stairs in a sepulchral silence, his heart beating an erratic rhythm that seemed too loud in that oppressive atmosphere. Reaching the entrance hall, he saw Sophia huddled near a potted plant, her eyes wide with concern. She looked at him as if he were a crystal vase about to shatter. He forced himself to compose his face, to shape his lips into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knelt again before her, his tiny, improbable savior. "Thank you, my angel," he whispered, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "You were very brave. Now, go back to your mom, and let's pretend our conversation never happened, okay? It's our secret." The girl nodded, childish understanding mixed with relief that he wasn't angry. She scurried to the kitchen, leaving Richard alone with the echo of betrayal. He retreated to his study, closing the heavy oak door as if he could lock the pain outside. He sat in his leather armchair, the place from which he commanded his empire, and felt utterly powerless. The room, once a symbol of power and conquest, now felt like a cage. He looked at the picture frame on his desk, a photo of him and Helen on their honeymoon in Italy, smiling at the camera, happiness so palpable it now seemed a cruel lie. Beside it, another photo, him and Luke at graduation, arms around each other, the future shining in their eyes, a farce, all of it a farce. For how long? Months? Years? Small details began to surface in his memory, pieces of a puzzle he never knew he was assembling, knowing glances between the two, conversations that hushed when he approached, Luke's business trips coinciding with Helen's girls' weekend getaways. His generosity, his trust had been used as weapons against him. The pain gave way to a cold fury, a steely resolve. They had underestimated him. They thought a good man was a weak man. They would learn the hard way that they were wrong. He would not be the victim in his own story. He would feign ignorance, observe, and when the time was right, dismantle their castle of lies, brick by brick. The sound of soft footsteps approaching the door made his body tense. The doorknob slowly turned. It was Helen. Her face, beautiful and serene as always, appeared in the crack of the door. "Richard, darling, what a surprise. I didn't know you were home." Her smile was a work of art, perfectly calibrated to convey surprise and affection. But to Richard, who now saw the world through a filter of betrayal, it was a grotesque mask. He stood, forcing his muscles to relax, to adopt a casual posture that belied the chaos in his soul. The meeting was postponed, a time zone issue with the investors. He lied, the first of many lies he would have to tell to survive. His voice sounded steadier than he expected. "Thought I'd take advantage of the free afternoon. What are you doing home? I thought you were having lunch with your sister, Marcella." He watched her closely. Every micro-expression, every blink. "Marcella cancelled last minute," she replied, pulling back slightly, her blue eyes studying his face. "Are you all right? You look surprised." She chuckled, a light, musical laugh that now sounded like shattering glass in his ears. "You look wonderful, as always," he said, shifting his gaze to the window, to the sunlight that seemed to mock the darkness that had settled within him. "I saw Luke's car outside. Wasn't he supposed to be in Chicago?" The question came out deliberately casual, as if it were an unimportant detail. He watched her face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker, but there was nothing. Helen was a talented actress. Oh, yes, it was crazy. His flight was cancelled because of bad weather there. He just stopped by quickly to drop off some travel documents you forgot. He actually just left. Too bad you missed each other by so little. The lie was so fluid, so well constructed, that for a 6 second he almost admired it. Just left. But he'd heard him upstairs minutes ago, dropping off documents. In their bedroom, the audacity was suffocating. "I see. What rotten luck," he replied, walking to his desk and pretending to organize some papers. "Well, since I'm here, I'll get some work done. I need to review the expansion contracts before the new meeting date." He needed to be alone. He needed to think. Every second in her presence was torture, a test of his self-control. "Of course, darling, I'll ask Vera to prepare a snack for you. Don't overdo it," she said, her voice filled with a false solicitude that sickened him. She left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, dense. Richard waited a minute, then another, his heart still pounding. Their plan was clear: undermine his credibility, make him seem unstable to force him to sell his shares for a pittance. And they would use intimate information, secrets he had only shared with Helen. The anger gave way to a cold, razor-sharp focus. He couldn't trust anyone except, perhaps, little Sophia and her mother, Vera, who had always shown silent, unwavering loyalty. His eyes darted to the steel filing cabinet built into the wall behind a painting. There, he kept the physical copies of the most important contracts. The southern expansion, the project Luke was supposedly leading, was his biggest gamble for the year. He turned the lock secret, a code only he and, theoretically, Luke knew. The door opened with a soft click. He pulled out the drawer labeled Southern Expansion, Preliminary Contracts. His hand hovered over the blue folder containing the main agreement, the document that outlined the entire financial structure of the project. He pulled it out. It was lighter than he remembered. He opened the folder, and his blood ran cold. The pages were there, but the crucial addendum, the detailed investment clauses and profit projections that justified the company's valuation, was gone. It wasn't just out of order. It simply wasn't there. A silent alarm blared in Richard's mind, shrill and deafening. The missing addendum wasn't a mere oversight. It was a fundamental piece that, in the wrong hands, could be used to drastically undervalue the company. It was the mathematical proof of its potential, the financial heart of the project. Luke knew this. Helen, with her growing interest in business in recent months, probably did too. The sabotage was no longer a whispered threat from behind a door. It was a concrete reality, materialized in the empty folder in his hands. He felt a wave of nausea. They weren't just planning the attack, they had already begun it. Each passing day, each false smile from Helen, each fraternal email from Luke was part of a war he didn't even know he was fighting. Paranoia, a feeling he had always scorned as a sign of weakness, began to settle into his veins like slow poison. Who else knew? Who else was involved? The chauffeur, Luke's secretary. The web of deceit could be much wider than he imagined. He replaced the folder, closed the cabinet, and swung the painting back to its original position. He needed to act as if nothing was wrong. His ignorance was, for now, his only armor. He left the study and went to the kitchen. Vera was turned away, washing vegetables at the sink, while Sophia drew in a notebook at the small corner table. The domestic scene was so normal it seemed surreal. "Vera," he said, his voice calm. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Mr. Richard, Mrs. Helen said you wanted a snack." "Yes, please. But first, I need a favor." He looked at Sophia, who lifted her head from her drawing, her eyes big and curious. "Sophia, would you mind waiting outside in the garden for just a minute? I want to talk to your mom about something for grown-ups." The girl obeyed without question, taking her notebook and exiting through the back door. When they were alone, the atmosphere shifted. Richard lowered his voice, urgency clear in his tone. "Vera, I know what Sophia told me, and I believe her. I need your help, but it has to be our absolute secret. No one can know we're talking about this, especially Mrs. Helen." Vera's face, usually serene, contorted into a mask of worry. She was a simple woman, but extremely perceptive. In the 5 years she'd worked there, she'd seen more than she let on. "Sir, I don't want any trouble. Sophia is just a child, she doesn't understand things," she began nervously. "I know," Richard interrupted gently, "and that's why I need to protect both of you. Vera, very wrong things are happening in this house, things that could harm me deeply. You and Sophia are the only people here I feel I can trust. I would never ask this if it weren't an emergency. Just tell me, have you noticed anything strange lately? Anything at all, no matter how small, between Mrs. Helen and Mr. Luke?" Vera hesitated, twisting the dishcloth in her hands. Her eyes darted to the floor, then the window, and finally met Richard's. The loyalty she felt for this man, who had always treated her with respect and dignity, who had paid for her mother's medical treatment and given her daughter birthday presents, outweighed her fear. They've been meeting a lot," she admitted in a low voice. "Mr. Luke comes here during the day when you're at the company. They say it's about work, but they stay in the study for hours with the door closed. And sometimes, when I come in to clean, they stop talking suddenly. Mrs. Helen also spends a lot of time on the phone, speaking quietly. She gets nervous when I come near." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his marriage, of his friendship. "Thank you, Vera. This is very important," he said, his mind racing. "Keep observing. Don't do anything differently, just pay attention. And please, look after Sophia. Don't leave her alone with Mrs. Helen." At that moment, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Luke. The text made Richard's blood boil, despite the friendly tone. "Buddy, heard the meeting got cancelled. Too bad. But hey, look on the bright side. More time for us to iron out the expansion details. Just noticed a few minor tweaks we need to make to Addendum C of the contract. Small stuff, but important. Check it out when you can. Cheers." Addendum C, the addendum that had vanished from his file. Luke's message was a master stroke in its subtle cruelty. It was a bait, a test. He was, disingenuously, asking, "Have you found out yet?" If Richard replied that he couldn't find the addendum, it would confirm his oversight and open the door for Luke to present an altered version of the document, claiming it was the original. If he said he had found it, he would have to explain how, given that the physical document was gone and the digital version, he now suspected, had likely also been tampered with. Luke was cornering him, using the very trust that once bound them as a weapon. Richard took a deep breath, the air seeming dense and thin. He needed time. He typed a carefully neutral response. "My head's not in the game today. I'll look at it tomorrow with a clear mind. Thanks for the heads up." It was vague enough not to raise suspicion, but firm enough not to seem desperate. Every interaction, from now on, would be a move on a chessboard where he was only just beginning to understand his opponent's rules. The paranoia that was once a whisper now screamed in his mind. The study, his sanctuary, was compromised. His home, his refuge, was the epicenter of the conspiracy. He returned to the study, closed the door, and sat before his computer. If the physical document was gone, the digital version was his next stop. He navigated through the company server's directories, a structure he himself had designed with multiple layers of security. He accessed the Southern Expansion project folder and clicked on the main contract file. A small pop-up window appeared on the screen, one he hadn't seen in years. "Access denied. You do not have permission to view this file." The shock was physical. He felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him, denied, in his own company. On the server he built, he tried again, typing his administrator password, the master key that opened all digital doors of his empire. The same message, access denied. Luke was the only one, besides himself, who had administrator privileges. The conclusion was obvious and devastating. Luke had locked him out. He had seized digital control of the company, cutting off his access to the most vital documents. The sabotage was deeper and more advanced than he had imagined. It wasn't just about stealing an addendum, but about taking control of the information infrastructure. He was being isolated, digitally exiled from his own kingdom. The feeling of powerlessness was overwhelming, but it lasted only an instant, quickly replaced by a calculating fury. Luke had made a mistake. By acting so aggressively, he had revealed the extent of his plan, and he had underestimated the depth of Richard's technical knowledge. If Luke could build digital walls, Richard could find a way to tear them down. He spent the next hours in a state of feverish concentration. He no longer attempted direct access, as that would leave a digital trail Luke could detect. Instead, he began exploring the system logs, the server's activity records. It was meticulous work, like looking for a needle in a haystack of codes and timestamps. And then he found it, a series of commands executed from Luke's terminal in the early hours of the morning. Permission changes, file movements to hidden directories, and, most alarming, the creation of a new administrator account with a name he didn't recognize. Luke wasn't just blocking him, he was building a parallel power structure within the system, likely with the intention of transferring total control to himself at the opportune moment. What he didn't know was that Richard, in an excess of caution years earlier, had created a backdoor in the system, an emergency protocol known only to him. It was his insurance policy against a digital catastrophe. He never thought the catastrophe would come from within. The sun was already setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, when Helen gently knocked on the door. "Darling, are you coming to dinner? You've been in there for hours." Her voice was melodic, but to Richard it sounded like a siren song luring him to the rocks. He stood, his muscles stiff with tension. "I'm coming," he replied, trying to sound tired, but not defeated. As he headed for the dining room, he knew the meal would be another performance. He would have to sit at the table with the woman who planned his destruction, smile, talk about trivialities, while their world silently crumbled around them. Passing through the hallway, he saw Vera and Sophia getting ready to leave. The girl ran to him and hugged his legs. "Bye, Uncle Rich," she said, her voice muffled against his pants. Richard placed his hand on her head, a protective gesture. "Bye, little one. Be safe." The glance he exchanged with Vera over the child's head was brief, but laden with mutual understanding. They were unlikely allies in this silent war, and as he walked toward the dining room, a new and terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. If Helen and Luke were capable of all this, how far would they go to ensure the only eyewitness, a 7-year-old girl, could no longer speak? Dinner was a symphony of silent tension. The clinking of silver cutlery against fine china sounded too loud in the oppressive silence of the dining room. Richard moved the food around his plate, the taste of herb-crusted sea bass, one of his favorite dishes, turning to ash in his mouth. Each mouthful was a monumental effort. Across the polished mahogany table, Helen ate with serene elegance, recounting anecdotes about her garden club, describing the difficulty of cultivating rare orchids. Her performance was flawless. She was the trophy wife, the perfect hostess, the devoted companion. But behind her blue eyes, Richard now saw the cold gears of a calculating mind. He wondered if she took some sadistic pleasure in this theater, if the forced normalcy amused her. He watched her, cataloging every gesture, every inflection in her voice, searching for a crack in the facade, a glimpse of the betrayer beneath the skin, but there was nothing. She was a fortress of deception. "You're so quiet today, darling," she commented, setting down her fork. "Did the meeting cancellation upset you that much?" Her voice was velvet, laden with a false concern that made Richard's skin crawl. "Just tired," he replied, taking a sip of wine. The liquid scraped his throat. "A lot of pressure lately." It was a half-truth. The pressure he felt, however, didn't come from the company, but from the woman seated opposite him. "I know," she said, reaching across the table and touching his hand. The contact was electric, repulsive. He didn't flinch. "That's why we have to take care of our home, our sanctuary, keep things in order without unnecessary stress." The mention of home was a knife twisting in his gut. This place had ceased to be a home the instant he heard her voice conspiring with Luke's. He looked at her face, illuminated by the soft light of the crystal chandelier, and for an instant the image superimposed itself over a memory. Years ago, when the company was just a dream in a rented room, they faced their first major crisis. A major client had pulled back, threatening to bankrupt the entire project. Richard had spent the night awake, sunk in despair on the small couch in the makeshift office. Helen had appeared at dawn with a thermos of coffee and a tired smile. She sat beside him, didn't say everything would be all right, didn't offer empty solutions. She simply held his hand and said, "I'm here. Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." In that moment, she had been his anchor, his strength. The memory, once a source of comfort, was now a source of searing pain. How had that woman transformed into this cold, manipulative stranger? Or, the more terrifying question, had she always been like this? And he, in his blind trust, simply never noticed. Her voice pulled him back to the present, the tone now more serious, more deliberate. "Speaking of keeping the house in order, I've been thinking about Vera." Richard's heart gave a painful lurch. He kept his expression neutral, but his senses were on high alert. "What about her?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Helen sighed, a rehearsed sound of concern. "She's an excellent employee, of course, but I'm not sure it's appropriate for Sophia to spend so much time here, especially now with school breaks. Children hear things, you know? They can misinterpret adult conversations, make up stories. I saw the girl talking to you this afternoon when I arrived. She seemed agitated. The attack was subtle, but the aim was precise. She was testing the waters, gauging his reaction, while simultaneously planting the seed of doubt about the child's credibility. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. It was worse than he thought. She wasn't just betraying him, she was preparing to discredit and dispose of the only innocent person who could expose her. "She was just showing me a drawing," he lied, his heart pounding. Helen smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, but still, perhaps it would be better for everyone, darling, if Vera found new employment, a place more suitable for bringing a child. It would be a way to avoid future misunderstandings." Helen's words hung in the air, delicate and poisonous like swamp mist. Avoid future misunderstandings. The phrase was a brutal euphemism to silence the only witness. She wasn't just suggesting firing Vera, she was proposing to extinguish the small flame of truth that Sophia, in her innocence, had ignited. Their plan was meticulous: isolate him, discredit him, and now eliminate anyone who could corroborate his version of events. In that instant, something within Richard changed irrevocably. The pain of betrayal, which had consumed him until then, crystallized into a glacial fury, a cutting clarity. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer just about his company or his broken heart. It was about the safety of an honest woman and her 7-year-old daughter. They had become pawns on Helen and Luke's cruel chessboard, and he would not allow them to be sacrificed. The facade of the complacent, weary husband crumbled internally, replaced by the armor of a protector. He met her gaze across the table, and for the first time since discovering the truth, allowed a spark of his true emotion to show through. It was a quick, almost imperceptible flash of steel and defiance. "Vera stays," he said, his voice low, but with a weight of finality that made Helen raise her eyebrows, surprised by his sudden resistance. "She's been with us for 5 years. Her loyalty is unquestionable, and Sophia isn't a problem. I like having her around." He stood, placing his napkin beside his untouched plate. "I've lost my appetite. I'm going to do some more work in the study." He turned and left, leaving her alone in the opulent dining room, the surprise on her face slowly giving way to a calculating expression. He knew he had just made his first open move on the board. He had challenged her suggestion, defended Vera and Sophia. Now, Helen would know he was no longer the passive man she imagined. The silent war had just seen its first shot fired. Back in the study, adrenaline pulsed through his veins. He needed more than the system's back door. He needed eyes and ears. He needed irrefutable proof. Something he could take to a board of directors that couldn't be dismissed as the delusion of an unstable man. He picked up the phone and called a number he hadn't used in years. On the other end, a grave, professional voice answered. "Marcus! It's Richard." Marcus was an old college colleague, a tech genius who had chosen a different path, opening a security and private investigation firm. They were discreet, efficient, and expensive. "Richard? Long time no see. Is everything all right?" Marcus's voice sounded concerned. "Something has," Richard replied, his jaw tight. "I need help. As discreet as possible. I need surveillance, bug sweeps, in my home and in my study. And I need a full report on all financial activities and communications for 2 people over the past 6 months. My partner, Luke, and my wife, Helen." There was a silence on the other end of the line, heavy with implication. Marcus asked no unnecessary questions. "Understood. My team can be there tomorrow morning before anyone else arrives. They'll pose as HVAC maintenance technicians. Send me the details. And Richard, be careful." Hanging up the phone was like crossing a point of no return. From that moment on, his house would be a minefield of hidden microphones and cameras, his life transformed into a counter-espionage operation. He spent the rest of the night using his back door to silently copy all server data to an encrypted external hard drive. Emails, call logs, old document versions, everything. It was during this frantic search that he found something that made him stop. The blood draining from his face. In a hidden folder created by Luke, there was a single audio file. The file name was simply Insurance. With his heart in his throat, he put on his headphones and clicked play. The voice that filled his ears wasn't Helen's or Luke's. It was his own voice. These were snippets of conversations, secretly recorded over months. He heard himself yelling in frustration at a vendor on the phone. He heard his voice thick with exhaustion after a week of sleepless work. He heard himself confiding in Helen about his insecurities, his pressures, his most intimate fears. Every moment of vulnerability, every outburst of stress, every whispered confidence in the dark had been captured, edited and compiled. They weren't just planning to allege he was unstable. They had created a dossier, a distorted montage of his life to prove it. And the person who had recorded it, who had given him the trust to open up, was his wife. Richard ripped off the headphones as if they were burning, throwing them onto the desk. The silence that followed was more deafening than the sound of his own voice, dissected and reconfigured as a weapon. It wasn't just the betrayal of a business secret, it was the desecration of intimacy, the violation of the soul. Every confidence, every moment of weakness he had shared with Helen in the darkness of their bedroom. Believing himself safe had been her performance, a data collection for his destruction. The poison of the discovery spread through his body, a chill no fireplace could warm. The woman he slept beside, to whom he whispered his fears when the weight of the world felt too heavy, was a spy in his own bed. The pain was so overwhelming, so physical, that he bent forward, burying his head in his hands, struggling to breathe. The audio dossier was the centerpiece of their plan. With that material, any argument he presented to the board could be invalidated as the delusion of a man on the edge. They would paint him as erratic, paranoid, incapable of leadership. It was an almost perfect checkmate. But the agony gave way to something harder, colder, a diamond-hard resolve. The sorrow transformed into fuel. He straightened in his chair, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a new intensity. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. Now, the battle wasn't just to save his company, it was to protect his honor, his sanity, and above all, the innocent people they were willing to crush in the process. Helen's suggestion about firing Vera now took on a much more sinister tone. It wasn't about misunderstandings. It was about eliminating a witness who could, with a single childish phrase, bring down their entire charade. The image of Sophia, with her big, frightened eyes, flashed in his mind, and a fierce protective instinct took hold. He would not let their darkness touch that child. The next morning dawned with a pale sunlight that seemed weak and sickly. He had barely slept, spending the night plotting, anticipating moves. At breakfast, the normalcy was torture. Helen was radiant in a linen dress, talking about the weather, the perfectly brewed coffee, her yoga class. Richard responded with monosyllables, claiming a headache. Every word from her, every smile was an insult. When the doorbell chimed precisely at 8 o'clock, he felt a mix of relief and dread. "That must be the AC maintenance," he said, rising before Helen could react. "I ordered a preventative checkup. With summer coming, I want to make sure everything's running perfectly." He opened the door to two men in grey work uniforms, discreet and professional. They were Marcus's team. "Good morning, sir. We're here to do central system maintenance," said the older man, not even looking at Richard, maintaining the performance for the audience of one who watched them from the dining room. "Of course, please. You can start with the east wing, the study and the bedrooms," Richard instructed, his heart pounding against his ribs. As Helen was distracted on the phone, he approached the team leader. "The main focus is my study and our bedroom. Look for anything. Cameras. Microphones, be thorough. She can't suspect a thing." The man simply nodded, a look of understanding in his experienced eyes. Richard retreated, feeling like a stranger in his own home, a conspirator against conspirators. As the men climbed the stairs with their toolboxes, his cell phone vibrated silently in his pocket. It was a message from Marcus. "Teams in. Stay alert. They'll update you here. We're already monitoring Luke's external communications. There was an unusual fund transfer from his account last night." Before Richard could process this new information, his cell phone vibrated again. This time, it was a call from the team leader upstairs. He answered, his voice a whisper. "Sir, you better come up. We found the first one, and it's active." Richard's heart hammered. He climbed the stairs in tense silence, his feet barely touching the treads. Helen was still on the phone in the living room, her voice a distant murmur that reminded him of the ever-present threat. In the upstairs hallway, one of the technicians awaited him, his face impassive. He made a silent gesture toward the master bedroom, the couple's sanctuary, now a nest of espionage. Upon entering, the other technician was crouched near the headboard of the bed on Helen's side. He pointed to the base of an innocent-looking bedside lamp. With delicate tweezers, he extracted a tiny device, smaller than his thumbnail, with a nearly invisible light point that blinked at regular intervals. It was active. It was transmitting. For how long had that electronic eye and ear been there, recording every conversation, every whisper, every sound of his intimate life? The violation was so profound, so personal, that he felt a wave of vertigo. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, suffocating. "It's state-of-the-art," the technician whispered, placing the device in an anti-static bag. powered by the lamp's own current, continuous transmission. We found another in your study's TV, and we're checking the smoke detector now. The house was no longer a home, it was a recording studio. Richard felt naked, exposed, every word he'd spoken in recent months potentially stored and ready to be used against him. The memory of the audio dossier hit him with renewed force. Those devices were the source. Helen didn't need a recorder in her pocket. She had turned the entire house into a trap. He left the bedroom, leaning on the railing, his mind spinning. He needed to compose himself, maintain the facade. Marcus's team was his only advantage, and he couldn't risk them being discovered. As he descended, he saw Vera arriving with Sophia. The girl ran toward him, as she always did, but stopped a few feet away, sensing the heavy atmosphere. She looked from Richard to the technicians, descending with their toolboxes, and her face crumpled in confusion. Helen ended her call and approached, a forced smile on her lips. "Are you finished already?" "How efficient." "Almost," replied the lead technician. "We found a small wiring issue in your bedroom, ma'am. Might have caused some fluctuations. We've fixed it." The lie was delivered with impeccable naturalness. "Oh, good," Helen said. Though her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, Richard noticed the glint of suspicion. She was intelligent. Anything out of the ordinary would put her on high alert. At that moment, Helen's gaze fell upon Sophia, who was shrinking slightly behind Vera's legs. Helen's smile became sharper, almost predatory. "Sophia, darling, how are you?" she said, her voice deliberately sweet. "You know, I was thinking, the other day, when you told me you saw Uncle Luke here, I think you got confused. He wasn't here that day. Sometimes, children have very fertile imaginations, don't they?" The change in tactics was sudden and brutal. She was no longer just planting seeds of doubt with Richard. She was confronting the child directly, trying to make her doubt her own memory, her own perception of reality. Richard saw Sophia's face contort in confusion and fear. The girl looked at her mother, then at Richard, seeking help. But I saw him," she whispered, her tiny voice trembling. "I saw his car, and I heard—" "Now, darling," Helen interrupted, her voice still soft, but with an edge of steel underneath. "It's not nice to tell lies. That can cause a lot of trouble for grown-ups, a lot of trouble for your mommy, you understand? Nobody likes a girl who makes up stories." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. The psychological pressure on the child was immense. Sophia looked at Richard, her eyes full of tears, her mouth trembling. She was trapped between the truth she had seen and the authority of the woman who accused her of lying. A woman who held power over her mother's employment. Richard felt his blood boil. He took a step forward, ready to intervene, to protect the girl from Helen's cruelty. But before he could speak, Sophia turned to him, panic etched on her face. Her voice choked with tears. She said the words he most feared to hear. "Uncle Rich, I lied. I'm sorry. Uncle Luke wasn't here. I made it all up." Richard's heart shattered. Sophia's forced confession, wrenched out under the weight of manipulation and fear, was more painful than any lie Helen could have told. He saw the truth in the girl's tear-filled eyes, a truth she was now forced to deny. He saw the subtle triumph on Helen's face, the satisfaction of someone who had just neutralized a threat. The woman he once loved was destroying a child's innocence right in front of him, using fear as her cruelest weapon. The urge to explode, to expose Helen right then and there, to shout the truth for all to hear, was almost unbearable. But he held back. A confrontation now would be disastrous. With Sophia's confession, any accusation he made would be seen as the final proof of his instability, of his paranoia in believing a child's fantasies. Helen had just turned the tables brilliantly and perversely. "It's all right, darling," Helen said, crouching down and placing a hand on Sophia's shoulder. The gesture, meant to be comforting, felt possessive, menacing. "I forgive you. But don't let it happen again, all right? Lying is very naughty." Sophia just nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. Vera, paralyzed beside her daughter, stared at the floor, her face a mask of helplessness and humiliation. Richard felt a wave of protective fury. He stepped forward, deliberately interposing himself between Helen and the child. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and controlled, but imbued with an authority that made Helen take a step back. "You didn't need to be so harsh with her," Richard said, his voice glacial. "She's just a child." "I was just teaching an important lesson," Helen replied, the sweetness in her voice disappearing, replaced by a defensive tone. "We need honesty in this house, from everyone." The hypocrisy was so thick he could almost taste it. "I agree," he said, looking her directly in the eyes. "Honesty is fundamental." The silent challenge hung between them for a long moment. He knew that from that instant, Sophia was in danger. Helen saw her no longer as the housekeeper's daughter, but as an uncontrolled variable, a witness who needed to be permanently silenced or discredited. The suggestion to fire Vera was no longer a suggestion, it was a priority for her. Later, as Marcus's team finished their work, installing their own surveillance devices, micro cameras in smoke detectors, audio recorders in electrical outlets, Richard received another message. It was a preliminary report from Marcus. "We found the transfer. Luke moved a large sum to an offshore account. But the interesting part is the final destination. The money was used to pay the first installment on a luxury property in Lisbon. The purchase contract is in 2 names, Luke and Helen. The proof was there, cold and digital. It wasn't just a corporate takeover. It was the planning of a new life together, financed with the money they planned to steal from him. The betrayal was complete, encompassing every aspect of his life, professional, personal, and financial. They weren't just stabbing him in the back. They were digging his grave and building their new home on top of it. The pain he felt was different. It was no longer the sharp shock of discovery, but a deep, chronic ache, the recognition that everything he believed to be real was a carefully constructed illusion. He looked out his study window, seeing the city stretch out below him, an empire he had built with sweat, passion, and, ironically, trust. And the 2 people he trusted most were about to take everything from him. At that moment, his personal phone, the one Helen didn't know he had, rang. It was Vera. Her voice was a terrified whisper, barely audible. "Mr. Richard, I need to speak with you, alone. It's about Sophia, Mrs. Helen. She was in the kitchen, she spoke to me, and she gave me a deadline." "A deadline for what, Vera?" he asked, his heart turning to ice. "To leave. She gave me until the end of the week to resign and disappear. If not, she said she'd make sure I never get another job, and that she'd report me to Child Protective Services, saying I'm a negligent mother and that Sophia makes up stories because she doesn't get proper attention at home." Helen's threat was of an abject cruelty, a low blow aimed not at Richard, but at the most vulnerable person within her reach. To use Child Protective Services, to turn Vera's love for her daughter into a weapon against her, was an act of villainy that transcended greed. It was pure evil. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet for a second. Helen wasn't just trying to remove a witness. She was willing to destroy a woman's life and traumatize a child to cover her tracks. The safety of Sophia and Vera had become the most critical and urgent point of this entire crisis. The company, the money, the betrayal of his friend, all of it paled before the direct threat to 2 innocent people who had been dragged into this nightmare because of him. "Don't do anything, Vera," he said, his voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions. "Don't resign. Don't say anything to her. Just carry on as usual. I'll fix this. I promise. No one will hurt you or Sophia." He hung up the phone, his mind working at dizzying speed. The strategy of waiting and collecting evidence needed to be accelerated. Helen was becoming reckless, desperate to eliminate any obstacle. This desperation made her dangerous, but also more prone to making mistakes. The threat against Vera was one such mistake. He now had a new piece of information, new proof of her coercion and cruelty, but he needed something more concrete than just Vera's testimony, which Helen would easily dismiss as the lie of a resentful employee. Thanks to Marcus's team, he now had the house under his own surveillance. The kitchen, where Helen had made the threat, was equipped with a microphone. He just needed her to repeat the threat. He needed to create a situation that would force her to show her true colors again. The next day, he acted. During breakfast, he casually mentioned that he had spoken with Vera. "She seemed quite upset yesterday," he said, observing Helen's reaction. "And I think we were a bit too harsh with Sophia. I thought of giving Vera a bonus this month as an apology, and perhaps even help with Sophia's new school costs next year." It was a calculated provocation. By showing explicit support for Vera and Sophia, he was directly challenging Helen's plan to get rid of them. He saw her jaw tighten for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrow into a slit of irritation before the mask of serenity returned. "You're very generous. And darling," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "But perhaps it's not the best idea. It might send the wrong message, as if we're rewarding bad behavior." "I don't see it that way," he calmly retorted. "I see it as supporting a loyal employee who's going through a tough time." The bait was cast. He knew Helen wouldn't let that slide. His show of support for Vera would make her feel she was losing control of the situation, forcing her to increase pressure on the housekeeper, and he would be waiting. He spent the rest of the morning in his study, with an earpiece discreetly positioned, listening to live audio from the house. He heard the normal sounds of routine, the vacuum cleaner, water running, the TV on. The tension was almost unbearable. Then, around lunchtime, he heard it. Helen's voice, coming from the kitchen microphone, low and sibilant. She had cornered Vera near the pantry. "And I thought I had been clear," Helen said, the false sweetness completely absent from her voice. "Your loyalty should be to me, not to him. He's confused, he's not well. And your daughter is making things worse with her stories. You have until tomorrow to hand in your resignation letter. If you don't, I will keep my promise. I will call Child Protective Services and tell them I'm very concerned about Sophia's well-being under your care. Do you understand me now?" Richard closed his eyes, the sound of the explicit threat echoing in his ears. He had it. He had the proof. It was cruel. It was horrible, but it was the ammunition he needed. At that moment, his cell phone vibrated with a message from Marcus. The text was short and devastating. "Richard, bad news. Luke has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. The sole item on the agenda is a motion for your immediate removal from the presidency, citing emotional instability and mismanagement. He's going to present the dossier." Time was up. The final attack was scheduled for the next day. Marcus's message was like a death sentence. The checkmate he so feared was upon him, just 24 hours away. Luke and Helen were no longer moving in the shadows. They were launching their final offensive. A frontal assault designed to decapitate him and seize control of the empire he had built. The board meeting was the stage, and the audio dossier, the murder weapon. They would humiliate him, destroy him psychologically and professionally, all in a single afternoon. For an instant, panic threatened to overwhelm him. The feeling of being cornered, of time and options running out, was suffocating. He looked around his study, at the symbols of his success, the awards, the photos of completed projects, the growth charts, and everything seemed fragile, about to be swept away by a hurricane of betrayal. The recording of Helen's threat to Vera was powerful. But would it be enough to turn an entire board against a long-standing partner who had no doubt been poisoning their minds against him for months? He took a deep breath, forcing air into his lungs. The panic receded, replaced by a glacial clarity. This wasn't the end. It was the final confrontation. It was time to stop reacting and start attacking. They had underestimated his resilience, his ability to fight when cornered. They saw him as a good, trusting man and mistook kindness for weakness. Now, he would show them the strength that came from protecting what he truly valued, not just the company, but justice, loyalty, and the safety of the innocent people who depended on him. He spent the next hours in feverish, focused activity. With Marcus's remote help, he compiled all the evidence he had gathered. The financial report tracing Luke's fund transfer for the property purchase in Lisbon, the copies of the server logs showing the alteration of permissions and the blocking of his access, the security team's reports detailing the listening devices found in his home, and, finally, the crystal-clear recording of Helen's threat to Vera. He prepared everything into a concise, irrefutable presentation. Each piece of evidence was a link in a chain of conspiracy, fraud, and coercion. But he knew that facts alone might not be enough to shake the board's loyalty to Luke. He needed something more. He needed an element of surprise, something they would never expect. He made one more call to Marcus, explaining his audacious plan. It was risky, placed a lot of pressure on one person, but it was his best chance to expose not just what they had done, but who they truly were. That evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was unbearably heavy. Helen acted as if nothing was happening, planning a dinner for the weekend, discussing the color of new curtains for the living room. Her normalcy was psychotic. Richard played his part, that of the distracted, overwhelmed husband, knowing that every second was a countdown to the battle of his life. He barely slept, his mind replaying every detail of the plan, every possible outcome. The next afternoon, he entered the board meeting room with an outward calm that belied the storm within. The board members, men and women he had known and respected for years, greeted him with cold formality, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and distrust. Luke was already there, seated at the opposite head of the table, his face a mask of solemn concern. His hypocrisy was masterful. The meeting began. Luke took the floor, his voice choked with false emotion. He spoke of his friendship with Richard, of their years of partnership. And then he began the attack. He spoke of Richard's erratic behavior, his growing paranoia, his emotional instability. And as the coup de grace, he announced he held an audio dossier compiled with great regret by his wife, Helen, who was deeply concerned for her husband's health. He was about to press play. "Before you do that, Luke," Richard interrupted him, his voice calm, but cutting the air like a blade. All eyes turned to him. "I also have something to present, a slightly different perspective on recent events." He projected the first piece of evidence onto the large screen, the offshore account statement. Luke's face paled. Richard continued, presenting proof after proof, the narrative of betrayal unfolding before the shocked eyes of the board. The digital sabotage, the illegal surveillance, the financial fraud. The room was in stunned silence. "And as for my instability," Richard continued, "it was carefully manufactured. And the main witness to my paranoia has a very particular way of dealing with people who might speak the truth." He signaled to the door. The boardroom door opened, and who entered was not a lawyer or an investigator. It was Vera, and by her side, holding her hand, was Sophia. Vera and Sophia's entrance into the boardroom was like silent thunder. The air, already charged with tension, became electric. The board members, imposing figures in the corporate world, looked confusedly at the woman in a simple uniform and the girl with frightened eyes who clutched at her mother's skirt. Luke, caught completely off guard, stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Their presence there was something he could never have predicted in his cold calculations. Richard rose and walked to them, placing a reassuring hand on Vera's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he said, his voice resounding with quiet authority, "I apologize for the unusual interruption, but this is Vera, who has worked in my home for 5 years with exemplary loyalty, and this is her daughter, Sophia. The conspiracy to remove me from this company did not begin with tampered documents or illegal wiretaps. It began with a whispered sentence from this courageous little girl, who had the audacity to tell the truth. He then activated the audio. Helen's voice, clear and cruel, filled the room, uttering the threat against Vera and Child Protective Services. A murmur of shock ran through the table. The councillors' faces transformed, their distrust of Richard replaced by a visible repulsion at the cruelty they had just heard. Luke's dossier, which had earlier seemed devastating proof, was now seen in a new light, the product of sordid manipulation. Luke did not act alone, Richard continued, his gaze fixed on his ex-friend, who now looked small and pathetic in his chair. His main accomplice, the architect of my supposed instability, was my wife. He didn't need to say anything more. The recording spoke for itself. The betrayal was complete, and the tactic of using a child and her mother as pawns revealed the true nature of Luke's character. The board chairman, a man with grey hair and an impeccable reputation, cleared his throat, his face a mask of contained fury. "Luke, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Luke opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked around the room, seeking an ally, a look of compassion, but found only scorn. The armor of confidence and concern he had worn for so long disintegrated, revealing the ambitious, unscrupulous man beneath. Within minutes, the vote was unanimous. Luke was stripped of his board position and expelled from the company, with a full investigation into fraud and conspiracy to be launched immediately. Richard's first victory was overwhelming, but the taste was bitter. By exposing the truth, he had annihilated the man he once called brother. When he returned home that night, the mansion was silent and cold. Helen's belongings had vanished from their closet and bathroom. There was a single envelope on the bed. Inside, divorce papers and a short, emotionless note. "You won, I hope you're happy." There was no remorse, no apology, just the cold acknowledgement of a defeat. He sat on the edge of the bed he had shared with her for years and felt a profound emptiness. He had won the battle for his company, but lost his personal life. The loneliness of victory was a high price, an echo in every room of that immense, empty house. In the days that followed, Richard's life transformed. He buried himself in work, restructuring the company, reaffirming the trust of his employees and investors. Justice ran its course. Luke and Helen faced the legal consequences of their actions, the financial fraud and conspiracy becoming a criminal process that would remove them from his life forever. He had retained control of his empire, his second victory, but felt like a king in an empty castle. One afternoon, he was in his home study, looking out the window, when he saw Vera and Sophia in the garden. The girl ran after a butterfly, her crystalline laughter floating on the air. Vera watched her, a genuine, relaxed smile on her face for the first time in weeks. Richard descended and went to them. "Vera," he began, "I know an apology isn't enough for what you've been through. You were dragged into my nightmare, and I will never forget your courage." He knelt in front of Sophia. "And you were my hero. You know, you saved me." The girl smiled, a shy but true smile. Richard stood and looked at Vera. "I don't want you to leave. In fact, I had an idea. There's a guest house at the back of the property. It's small but comfortable. I'd like to offer it to you. No rent, no obligations. Just a safe place to live for as long as you want. Consider it your own." Vera's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She nodded, unable to speak. That was his final victory. Not legal justice, not control of the company, but the ability to use his power to protect and care for those who had shown him the true meaning of loyalty. 4 weeks. A single month had passed since the day Richard's world had shattered. The mansion, which once felt like a mausoleum of poisoned memories, now breathed a different air. The afternoon sunlight, which once seemed to mock him, now streamed through the windows with a genuine warmth, dancing across the polished marble floor. The oppressive silence had been replaced by sounds he hadn't realized he missed: the distant hum of a lawnmower, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and, most importantly of all, the crystalline sound of a child's laughter coming from the backyard. Richard sat on the stone steps of the terrace, not with a tablet displaying stock charts, but with a glass of lemonade in his hand, watching Sophia. The girl, in a colorful dress, was trying to fly a small kite he had helped her assemble that morning. The kite stubbornly dipped, but Sophia's frustration lasted only a second before dissolving into another peal of laughter. Vera emerged from the guest house, now her home, carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies. She no longer walked with the hesitation of an employee, but with the tranquility of someone who belonged there. Their relationship had transformed into a silent friendship, built on a foundation of mutual respect and immeasurable gratitude. They didn't need many words. A glance, a smile was enough. "She'll wear herself out before the kite does," Vera said, sitting a comfortable distance away. "She doesn't get tired of being happy," Richard replied, and the truth in his own words surprised him. He, too, was learning not to get tired of being happy, to find joy in the simplicity of that moment. The pain of betrayal hadn't completely vanished. There were moments, in the dead of night, when the memory of Helen and Luke assailed him, an icy phantom reminding him of the depth of his deception. It was a scar he would carry forever, but the scar no longer hurt with the same intensity. It had become a reminder that his biggest failure wasn't trust itself, but the direction in which he had placed it. He had built his empire believing in the loyalty of contracts and strategic partnerships, when the truest loyalty lay in the silent integrity of a housekeeper and the instinctive courage of her daughter. He looked at his vast property. What was once a symbol of status and power now seemed different. It was a refuge, a place where he could protect what truly mattered. His altruism, once an almost casual trait, now had a focus. He had created a foundation to help struggling employee families, ensuring that loyalty was always a two-way street, protected and valued. Inside his study, the space on his desk where the photo of him with Helen used to sit remained empty. He felt no rush to fill it. The future was a blank page, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to write it alone. He finally understood that true wealth wasn't in the solidity of his investments, but in the strength of the bonds that withstood storms. Loyalty didn't shout in boardrooms. It whispered the truth in a silent hallway through a child's voice. Protecting the innocent wasn't just an act of kindness. It was the only way to preserve one's own soul. Sophia's kite finally caught an updraft, soaring high into the blue sky, a vibrant splash of color against the immensity, and Richard smiled, feeling, at last, free.